Hey there. Tonight, we'll be exploring the quietly strange story of why living in medieval times was challenging, sleep-inducing history. It's a tale filled with questionable decisions, misunderstood traditions, and more than a few very uncomfortable beds. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is as you're drifting off. It's always lovely to see who's joining in from around the world. Now, take a deep breath, dim the lights, maybe turn on a little, fan for that soft white noise, and let's slowly ease into tonight's sleepy little corner of history. In the still, smoky dawn of a medieval village, life began with aching hunger and ended with quiet fatigue. The air, always tinged with the scent of damp earth and ash, carried the subtle groan of survival, a low song sung by every peasant. Every dawn, food was not merely sustenance. It was a hope, a worry, a reward, and, sometimes, a ghost that did not appear. Most people in the Middle Ages, 9 of every 10 souls, were peasants. They lived not by coin, but by the seasons. The year was not counted in months, but in tasks: sowing, reaping, threshing, storing. The body was an instrument of the land, and every breath was timed to its slow turning. Breakfast, if there was one, might be a piece of dark bread from coarse rye or barley, toughened at the edges, soaked in water or milk if fortune allowed. This bread, dense, grainy, and greyish, was a cornerstone of survival. To modern eyes, it would seem bland, maybe even bitter. But to the medieval peasant, it was the taste of life itself. Baking was often done communally in the village oven, where loaves bore marks to distinguish them: crosses, lines, small symbols pressed into dough by calloused thumbs. Ovens were hot, fuel was scarce, and mistakes could mean wasted flour. Tragic error: flour came not easily nor evenly. Before it became dough, it was grown under uncertain skies. Rains might fall too long, or not at all. Wheat, the finest grain, was often reserved for the rich, for monasteries, or for festival days. The poor made do with rye, barley, or even oats, often ground roughly and mixed with bean flour, acorns, or whatever was at hand. Grain storage was a dangerous business. Rats, damp, and mold claimed their share, and with it, people's lives. Lunch, or rather, the midday meal, was heavier when it could be. A stew might bubble in a blackened pot over a smoky fire. Cabbage, leeks, onions, garlic, vegetables that survived the poor soils and cold swam in thin broth with a few beans or lentils. Meat, rare. A bone, perhaps, if a rabbit had been caught. Often the only fat came from scraps of salted pork, used more to flavor than to fill. Meat was a dream for most peasants. Hunted animals were the property of lords, and poaching was punished cruelly. Chickens were valuable not for their meat, but for their eggs. Cows were precious: milk was needed, and a cow could birth calves. Killing an animal was a weighty decision, one taken only when it could feed many, or when the animal could give no more. Dinner came with dusk and was often similar to lunch stew: bread and a draught of ale or watered wine. Even water, though, was not always safe. Streams carried waste, and wells were not always clean. Ale was common, not for pleasure, but for health. Weak and low in alcohol, it was safer than the local water and drank by all men, women, and children alike. Seasons changed everything. In winter, food was stored: dried peas, pickled cabbage, smoked or salted meat if available. But storage was imperfect. Mold and rot crept in, and hunger crept closer. In the lean months often February and March, called the starving time, people stretched food thin. A crust here, a spoonful there. Hunger became a quiet companion, sitting beside them by the hearth, watching with hollow eyes. Festivals and feast days were brief interludes. When the church calendar allowed it, villagers might gather for shared meals. Then came pies of minced meat, roasted fowl, apples, and honeyed bread. But such days were rare, and the memory of them had to last through weeks of plain fare. Even on these days, much depended on charity, and generosity flowed from those who could afford to give. The kitchen was a space of smoke and labor. Fireplaces smoked more than they warmed, and black soot coated the walls. Cauldrons were hung on chains, or set near hot coals. Women cooked, stirred, prepared dole while tending children, fetching water, feeding animals, and minding the hearth. Cooking was not a leisure task, it was endurance. The smell of stew did not signal dinner, it warned of how little there was. Hunger had a rhythm in the medieval world. It came with the failed harvest, lingered in the cold months, and left only when the grain ripened again. Children grew thin, old people passed quietly, and bellies stayed hollow. Yet life went on. People endured, sang songs of better days, and hoped the next season would be kinder. The church taught that hunger was a test, that God watched and measured patience, that suffering cleansed the soul. But the body knew hunger differently. It creaked with it, shivered in its shadow, and longed for something warm, filling, uncertain. To live in the Middle Ages was to eat with uncertainty. Each meal was a victory, each loaf a shield against despair, and so they carried on through mud, mist, and meager meals, hoping the bread would last just a little longer. In the delicate balance of medieval life, where every mouthful was earned through toil, famine was more than an absence of food. It was a collapse of everything known. The land, so often counted on like a silent parent, would at times simply refuse, and when it did, it wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It just stopped growing. And in that stillness, fear crept quietly from hut to hut. The cycle of farming in the Middle Ages was already fraught with uncertainty. Seeds were saved year to year, often from already weak crops. Soil was worked with simple tools, wooden plows pulled by tired oxen, and no fertilizers beyond dung and ash. There were no pesticides, no irrigation systems, no greenhouses. If it rained too much, the grain drowned. If the sun lingered too long, it withered. There was no controlling nature. There was only praying and waiting. When a season turned cruel, the effects rippled out slowly at first. People noticed the grain heads looked thin, that the barley hadn't risen high, that the beans were soft or hollow. A bad harvest was not a surprise, it was a fear always lingering in the background. But when 2 or 3 poor seasons came in a row, the word changed. It became famine. One of the most dreadful instances came in the early 14th century. Between 1315 and 1317, what modern historians call the Great Famine swept through much of Europe. It began with relentless rain in the spring, rain that refused to stop. Fields turned to mud, seed rotted where it lay, and crops failed. Year after year, the rain returned, drowning every effort to recover, and without crops, animals starved too. Cattle collapsed in the pastures, chickens stopped laying, pigs went to slaughter early, and even then, there was little fat to be found. Hunger spread like a shadow across the countryside. Peasants boiled bark and nettles. Families ground acorns and weeds into flour, baking strange, bitter bread that turned the stomach and gave no strength. In desperation, some ate the seeds meant for next year. Others wandered from their villages in search of food and found only empty roads and other hungry faces. Starvation has a smell, and during these years it hung heavy in the air. The structure of medieval society made famine harder. Land was owned by lords and worked by peasants who owed rent in kind or labor. Even in years of poor harvest, obligations remained. A peasant might keep half his grain, maybe less. The rest went to taxes, to tithes, to fulfill ancient duties, carved into law and custom. Some lords were merciful, others were not. And when hunger touched the manor as well, mercy often dried up. Grain stores were raided, mills ground less and less. Bakeries shut their doors. Bread, once coarse but reliable, disappeared from daily life. In towns, markets fell quiet. The price of grain soared beyond reach, and those without coin, most of the population, watched the stalls grow bare. Hunger turned into crime, thefts increased, wooded roads became dangerous, even the gallows grew busy. Children fared the worst. Their small bodies couldn't survive long without nourishment. The toll was silent and enormous. Mothers wept over swaddled bundles that no longer stirred. Graveyards filled, and in the cloisters of monasteries, monks recorded the seasons in quiet, sorrowful script. This year, the fields gave nothing. This year, the people starved. Religion gave famine a language of sin. Some priests claimed it was punishment penance for pride or gluttony or greed. They urged prayer, fasting, humility. But for the peasant who had fasted unwillingly for weeks, such sermons offered little comfort, and yet they came. To the churches, to the altars, they knelt, they pleaded. They waited for rain to stop, for sun to shine, for the soil to forgive. In some places, whole villages were abandoned. People took to the roads, moving in ragged groups, looking for towns rumored to have food. Few found it. Towns closed there. Gates, disease followed in famines. Wake when the body is weak, it cannot fight illness. The simplest cold became deadly, and when meat returned to the pot, it was sometimes not the kind spoken of openly. Dark tales were whispered of starvation's cruelest extremes, of people who cooked what should never be cooked. It is said, famine changes not just the body, but the soul. Still, not all was despair. Some communities banded together. Grain was shared. The strong helped the weak. Monasteries opened their stores, offered soup and bread, even as their own supplies dwindled. Bonds formed in the fire of suffering, and in those long, lean nights, people discovered how deeply they depended on one another. The famine eventually passed, the rain stopped, the sun returned, new crops were planted, but something remained changed. The memory lingered in scarred bellies, in empty cradles, in stories told by hearthlight to the next generation, and even in years of plenty. No one ever truly forgot the years when the fields were silent and hunger spoke in every home. Famine was a teacher, though a cruel one. It taught that survival was never promised, that the earth, so full of life one year, could turn its face away the next, and that in such times, what mattered most was not just bread, but kindness, mercy, the quiet strength to keep going, even when the path was cold and bare. In a land where most lived by the soil and fought hunger daily, there existed another world, a world behind thick stone walls, where fires roared in great hearths, and food flowed like song. This was the world of the lords, of nobles, of bishops, and barons here. Meat was not a rarity, but a routine. Feasts were held not in honor of hunger, but in celebration of power. The table itself was a symbol of authority, and the meal a demonstration of wealth and dominion. To understand this contrast is to glimpse the heart of medieval inequality. The same fields that starved the peasant fed the castle. The same cow, milked dry for the village, might be roasted whole for a noble's feast. It wasn't just a matter of having merit, was the luxury of certainty. The nobleman did not wake wondering if there would be bread. He chose between venison or goose, between wine or ale, between honeyed pears or almond tarts. A feast in a medieval hall was not simply a meal lit, was a performance. Long tables stretched across vast chambers, covered in cloth and often strewn, with herbs to mask the odors of so many bodies gathered. The air was heavy with roasted meat, spiced sauces, and the soft clang of pewter. Torches sputtered along the walls, casting golden shadows on tapestries that told of battles, saints, and ancestors long past. Nobles ate from trenchers thick slabs of bread that served as plates. These were often given to the poor afterward, soaked in gravy and grease, though sometimes they were simply discarded. The food itself was varied and rich. Roasted boar with apples, capons stuffed with herbs, eels in almond milk, stews of beef and barley. Spices like saffron, cinnamon, and ginger were prized, brought overland and overseas at great cost, used not only for flavor but to dazzle guests with exoticism. For peasants who glimpsed these feasts, perhaps while serving or delivering goods, the experience was dreamlike. In their world, butter was precious, eggs were a gift, and meat came maybe once a month yet here. Meat was carved in great slabs and left half-eaten on wooden platters. Dogs sat at nobles' feet, gnawing bones that could have fed families. Drunken laughter rose into the rafters while outside. The village huddled against wind and cold. Even in smaller, noble households, the meals were structured with care. There was always bread-fine white loaves from sifted wheat. There was ale or wine, depending on the region and the wealth. Meals were served in courses, sometimes as many as 5 or 6. Dishes came not all at once, but in waves: fish, then fowl, then sweets. Between each course, entertainment might be offered. A musician, a storyteller, or a juggler. And always, the hierarchy was clear. Lords first, ladies next. Then knights, stewards, and down the line until the last crumb reached the servant hall. The church, too, held its share of the feast. Bishops and abbots presided over well-stocked kitchens. Monastic rules might forbid indulgence, but human nature found its way around such things. On paper, a monk's diet was humble bread, cheese, fish. In practice, some abbeys dined richly, especially on feast days. Wine from vineyards, cheeses ripened in cool cellars, preserved fruits, candied ginger, while the lay brothers labored. In the fields, their superiors dined in cloisters, where silence was broken only by the scrape of spoons and the murmured Latin of blessings. It wasn't simply the quantity of food that marked the divide, was the freedom to eat at will, to choose, to leave food uneaten without consequence, to experiment with flavor, with ingredients, with presentation. While the peasant woman counted out beans and stretched cabbage into thin stew, the noble cook was crafting peacock pies and molded jellies that glimmered in candlelight. This chasm between the tables was not merely economic, it was cultural. A noble's identity was affirmed by food. To feast was to show one's place in the divine order. Kings were chosen by God, and their abundance proved it. The poor were told to accept their lot humbly, to view their hunger as a spiritual trial. Even in stories and songs, food was often symbolic. A lost kingdom feasted, a false king starved. Bread and wine were sacred symbols in churches, and hunger itself was wrapped in theology. And yet, sometimes the walls were thinner than they seemed. Famine, war, or plague could level the divide, at least briefly. A failed harvest could reach even castle larders. Armies passing through might drain supplies. Disease respected no titles. And when the Black Death came, even noble banquets were silenced, their halls left echoing with absence. Still, in the ordinary rhythms of life, the contrast remained. The laborer harvested the grain, yet his loaf was coarse and small. The noble harvested taxes and tithes, and his table never ran dry. It was a world of shared soil but unequal stomachs where the same earth grew wheat for both crust and cake, and where the scent of roasting meat could mean either comfort or torment, depending on where one stood. The peasants watched, and sometimes whispered. They dreamed, sometimes envied, sometimes accepted. Their stories, passed by firelight, spoke of tables turned, of the poor rewarded in heaven, of lords who lost everything for pride. And still, the next morning, they rose, they tilled, they baked what they could, they endured, because even in a world where feasts were for the few, life for the many still needed to go on. In the quiet shadows of a medieval home, where the hearth rarely cooled and the air always carried the smell of smoke, food was not just precious, it was perilously fragile. There was no certainty that what was harvested, hunted, or traded would last. Time was the great thief, and in a world without refrigeration or modern sealing, every meal was a small victory over spoilage. To preserve food in the Middle Ages was to battle nature itself. Warmth brought mold, moisture bred rot. Insects arrived uninvited. Rats and mice, with their sharp teeth and clever ways, found their way into every storehouse and thatched roof. A single cracked clay jar, a hole in a wall, or a too warm corner could undo weeks of labor. Grain, the foundation of life, was the most vulnerable. After harvest, it had to be dried, threshed, winnowed, and stored in dry granaries or lofts. But dampness was ever the enemy. A cold, wet season could seep into the very walls of a barn, and mold would grow in the silence. Spoiled grain wasn't always visible to the eye, but its effects were deadly. Ergot, a toxic fungus that infected rye, caused terrible hallucinations, seizures, and even death. To those in medieval times, it was witchcraft or divine punishment. To us, it's a dark fungus. To them, it was unknowable. Meat, scarce and treasured, was preserved in a handful of ancient ways: salting, smoking, drying, and occasionally pickling. Large pieces of pork or beef were buried in casks of salt, layer upon layer, where the salt slowly drew out moisture and hardened the flesh. Smokehouses dotted the countryside, where slabs of meat hung for days in dense, fragrant clouds, turning dark and dry. But even then, preservation was no guarantee. Salt was expensive. Firewood took time. Flies, ever patient, found their way inside. A spoiled haunch could ruin not just a meal, but an entire winter's plan. Fish, a critical food, especially in religious communities where meat was forbidden on many days, was dried or brine. In coastal regions, herring and cod were preserved by the barrelful. Inland, they were brought overland, sometimes already half-spoiled, and yet they were eaten rinsed, soaked, boiled because there was no choice. Fruits and vegetables posed their own challenges. Apples, onions, and cabbages were among the few that stored well in cool, dark spaces. Root cellars, dug beneath homes or barns, kept the cold in and the rot at bay. Cabbages hung from rafters like strange, leafy lanterns, their outer leaves yellowing, their centers still good. Beans and peas were dried in the sun, strung on cords, or kept in sacks. But soft fruits, berries, leafy greens, they lasted days at best. Spoilage was part of life: bruised apples, fermented pears, mushy squash. The line between edible and inedible blurred with need. Milk turned quickly in summer and was made into cheese or butter whenever possible. Cheese, aged and firm, could last months if well cared for. Soft cheeses, however, were risky and often consumed quickly. Butter was packed in salt and kept cool, but even it would sour. And yet, these foods were vital. A spoiled pot of milk might mean the loss of nourishment for a whole family. Even the cooking process was part of the preservation struggle. Stews and pottages simmered all day, not just for flavor, but to extend their life. Leftovers were kept near the fire, reheated over and over until gone. Some dishes were designed to disguise the taste of spoilage, heavily spiced or soured. Vinegar and verjuice, sour grape juice, were used liberally, not only to flavor but to preserve. The noble kitchens had better means. Stone cellars, skilled cooks, imported spices, and ample salt. But even they faced rot. Even their granaries were not immune. Rats did not respect titles, and meat left too long, even in the larder of a king, could sour with the same speed as in a peasant smokehouse. Spoilage also affected morale. Imagine a winter's morning, cold and thin, where a mother unwraps a carefully saved piece of bacon only to find it green and reeking, or a stored sack of grain discovered wet and crawling with life. These were not mere inconveniences, they were tragedies. And in such a world, every spoiled loaf was a whisper of hunger yet to come. Seasons dictated everything. In spring, when the last of the stored food had dwindled, and the new crops had not yet grown, people entered the hungry gap. This was the time of stretching every resource, of boiling dried roots, of eating preserved scraps, and of hoping always. Hoping that the coming season would not fail them. Spoilage was more than a biological process. It was a presence. It haunted pantries. It crouched behind barrels. It crept into jars and hung in the air like a curse. People developed deep instincts, smelling, prodding, tasting, hesitating. A housewife could sense bad cheese with a glance. A farmer knew when grain felt wrong between his fingers. Children were taught to scrape mold with care, to cut deeper into bread if the crust showed green. The church, as with all things, had its say. Spoilage was sometimes seen as a divine messenger, warning of waste, a punishment for greed, or a call to humility. Yet it was also seen as a test. Would one throw away the bread or risk eating it? Would one feed it to the pigs, or give it to the very hungry? In time, communities adapted. They passed down knowledge how to dry herbs, how to pack meat, how to line barrels with wax or cloth. But the fear never truly left. For, in a world where survival was a daily chore, the rot of a single meal was more than a misfortune, it was a danger, a stolen future, a lost chance. And so, every bite that made it to the mouth safe, sustaining, warm, was a triumph. A quiet, unseen victory over time, over spoilage, over decay. Imagine a quiet village at dusk, rooftops, low and uneven, chimneys breathing pale threads of smoke into the air. The wind moves gently through bare trees, rustling thatch and stirring dry leaves along narrow paths. Beneath this fading light, the homes of the medieval world sit huddled together, not so much inviting as enduring weathered shelters against the long dark night. To live in a medieval home was to live close to the elements. These structures, whether in the countryside or clustered within a town's protective walls, were built with what was available: timber from nearby forests, stone from quarries, straw from the fields, and mud from underfoot. Beauty was rarely the goal. These were practical homes, built for function, patched as needed, and aged by wind, rain, and time. For the average peasant, the house was often little more than a single room. It served every purpose: cooking, sleeping, eating, working, and, when needed, sheltering animals. The walls might be wattle and daub, wooden slats woven like a basket, then plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, dung, and clay. When dry, it held out the wind well enough until the rains came, softening it again. The roof was thatched with reeds or straw, thick enough to keep out the worst of the rain, but often housing unwelcome guest rats, birds, even insects. In the cold months, snow would sometimes gather on the roof and drip through, slowly soaking the thatch until it sagged. When fire caught a thatched roof, it moved fast and left nothing but ash. Floors were packed, dirt, uneven and dusty, sometimes scattered with rushes or straw. These were replaced every so often, especially when they grew soiled from spilled food, animal droppings, or the muddy boots of daily life. There was little thought of cleanliness in our modern sense. Clean meant dry. Clean meant not crawling with lice or fleas. Light came from the hearth, from a small window with no glass, just wooden shutters, or waxed cloth, and from tallow candles or oil lamps, which sputtered and smoked. The interior of a home was dark. Always, even at noon, the corners stayed in shadow. And in winter, there were days when it felt as though the sun never truly arrived. The hearth was the center of everything. It was where meals were cooked, where hands were warmed, where children sat drowsily at night. Yet even the fire was a struggle. Firewood was scarce in some regions. Gathering it meant hours in the woods, or permission from a lord's forest, or even fines for trespass. A good fire was slow and smoky, not for comfort, but to preserve fuel. Smoke filled the home. Chimneys were rare in peasant cottages. The smoke drifted upward and out through a hole in the roof or eaves. It clung to beams, blackened rafters, and settled into fabric and skin. Breathing was rough, eyes watered, coughing was common, but smoke also helped cure meat and kept pests at bay. It was a burden, yes, but also a tool. Furniture was minimal and handmade. A rough-hewn table, a bench or stool, perhaps a wooden chest for clothes and tools. Beds were platforms of wood or rope, covered with straw-stuffed mattresses or sacks. Sheets were rare. Woolen blankets, furs, if lucky, and bodies huddled close were the only defense against the cold. In wealthier homes, those of merchants, minor officials, or free farmers, the structure improved slightly. 2 rooms, perhaps, a loft, stone instead of daub, glass panes for windows. But even these were far from comfort. Heat remained elusive, privacy scarce, furniture simple. The wealth was modest, the cold was not. And then, in stark contrast, were the homes of the nobility, castles, manors, and fortified halls. Stone walls, tall and thick, fireplaces large enough to walk into, tapestries hung from walls to trap heat and block drafts, windows with small panes of colored glass, multiple rooms, wooden floors, kitchens apart from the living quarters. Here, at least, warmth was possible if not always reliable. Yet even these grander homes had their challenges. Stone, while stronger than timber, held the cold. A castle in winter was a place of icy corridors and drafty stairwells. Fires roared in the great hall, but bedrooms, cellars, and passageways often stayed chill. And without modern insulation, heat escaped quickly. Blankets and furs were piled high. Bed hangings and canopies trapped what warmth they could. In the dead of winter, nobles slept in layers, and still whether peasant or lord everyone understood cold. Everyone lived with damp clothes, frozen fingers, and breath that misted indoors. Everyone knew the sound of wind rattling shutters, or the creak of ice forming in the night. But a home was still a place of safety, a place where bread was broken, children lulled to sleep, stories told in the flicker of firelight. Despite the discomfort, there was a sense of routine. The home, however humble, marked one's place in the world, and so people mended their thatch, patched their daub, and banked the fire each night with careful hands. They gathered close when the wind howled. They shared warmth not from wood or stone, but from each other. It was not comfort as we know it today, but it was shelter, it was home. Winter in the medieval world did not arrive gently. It came slowly but unmistakably, first in the bite of a morning breeze, then in the hardening of the earth beneath bare feet. The trees turned skeletal, the sun grew shy, and all the soft green of the countryside shriveled into brittle grey. And when the cold truly set in, it stayed. Days shortened, nights stretched, and warmth became not a feeling, but a memory. For those living in thatched cottages and timbered huts, winter was not romantic. It was survival. The walls, thin and roughly patched, offered little against the icy wind. Cold crept under doors, along stone floors, through unshuttered gaps in the walls. Blankets were few, furs fewer, and fires burned low because the woodpile never seemed to last long enough. Each night brought a question unspoken aloud. Will this be the one when the fire goes out? To prepare for winter was a year-long task. Firewood was gathered in summer, chopped, dried, and stored under lean-tos or in corners of barns. Hay was stacked in great mounds for animals. Salted meat hung in rafters. Dried beans, peas, onions, apples all, saved in jars, baskets, sacks. But even with careful planning, the stores always ran thin. Always. The cold, of course, was not just outside. It settled indoors like a second presence. Without proper insulation, the heat from a fire was fleeting. It warmed the space immediately in front of the hearth, but little more. Those nearest the flames enjoyed brief relief, while others huddled in corners wrapped in cloaks, scarves, or old linens. Rooms farther from the firelofts, back corners, storage space, might never warm at all. People dressed in layers, wool tunics over linen shirts, cloaks and hoods, mittens or fingerless gloves. In some households, clothes doubled as blankets. At night, Entire families slept together for warmth. Parents, children, sometimes even animals. Dogs curled at feet. Cats nestled in crooks of arms. Chickens might sleep in corners, their feathers a slight, welcome comfort. Washing, when it happened, was brief and bracing. Water from barrels froze overnight. To bathe meant heating it over the fire first, then crouching beside a basin or tub, quickly scrubbing before the chill set in again. Often, hygiene gave way to practicality. Better to be cold and dirty than clean and frozen. The elderly, the sick, and infants suffered most. Babies were swaddled tightly in cloth, sometimes wrapped in warm ashes from the fire, or laid close to mothers for body heat. The old wrapped themselves in shawls and rarely moved far from the hearth. A cold night could take a life quietly, like a whisper. No illness, no injury, just a quiet slipping away in the dark. Church bells still rang through winter, though they sounded softer under snow. People still worked feeding animals, mending tools, spinning wool by firelight. The rhythm of life slowed but never stopped. Bread still had to be baked. Water still had to be fetched from icy wells or carried from nearby streams. Roads turned to ice, then mud, then ice again. Travel grew dangerous, and many simply stayed in place, huddling near the fire, speaking softly, conserving energy. There were few distractions, no books for most, no glowing screens, no music but what could be sung. Storytelling became an art passed down in flickering firelight. Tales of heroes, saints, miracles, of warmer lands, of seasons yet to come. These stories warmed where blankets could not. Inside noble halls, winter looked different, but even then, it was not comfortable. Castles held more stone than softness. Though fires blazed in great hearths and tapestries lined the walls, draughts slipped under heavy doors and echoed down corridors. Servants shuffled in layers, hands red and cracked. Courtyards froze. Water in pitchers turned to ice overnight. Nobles dined in gloves and furs, drank warm wine spiced to stave off the chill. To combat the cold, some wore fur-lined cloaks, filled shoes with straw, or placed warm bricks wrapped in cloth at the foot of their beds. Others spread rushes thick on the floor or hung animal hides across doorways. Anything to dull the bite of air. And yet, amidst all this hardship, there were moments of strange beauty. Snow muffled the world, softening it. Icicles shimmered in morning light. The village glowed faintly from within as candlelight flickered through gaps and shutters. In this quiet, people found small joys: a warm bowl of pottage, a successful fire that burned through the night, the shared warmth of family huddled together. Winter forced closeness. It demanded patience. It encouraged stillness. And when winter began to loosen its grip, when the snow began to melt and birds sang faintly, once more there was a release, not just from the cold, but from the fear it brought. Doors were opened, clothes aired out, children ran barefoot again. Firewood was restacked for next time, and always, people remembered. The cold might return, but for now, the worst had passed. Surviving winter in the medieval world was never easy, but it was endured day by day, night by long, cold night. And in that quiet strength, a kind of warmth could be found, not from fire or fur, but from the simple will to go on, even when everything around seemed frozen. In the medieval home, no sound was more comforting than the crackle of a fire. It whispered of warmth, of cooking stew, of life held back from the cold. The hearth was not merely a convenience, it was survival. And yet, this flickering companion brought with it a constant risk, a danger always present in the edge of the flame. To keep a fire lit was to maintain life. Without it, food went uncooked, water froze, sickness took hold, and spirits fell. Yet, unlike today's controlled gas flames or flicked switches, medieval fire was living and wild. It had to be watched, coaxed, fed. A fire that grew too weak would die. One that grew too strong could devour the very house it was meant to warm. In most peasant homes, the hearth sat in the center of the single room. There was no chimney, only a hole in the roof, or none at all. Smoke rose slowly, filling the space before drifting out through gaps in the thatch or eaves. It stung the eyes, crept into lungs, and blackened the walls with soot. Over time, the rafters grew so dark with smoke they looked charred even if untouched by flame. The hearth was kept low to the ground, often just a flat space lined with stones or hard-packed earth. Pots hung over it by chains, or sat directly. In the embers, ashes were banked at night to preserve the heat, and with luck, a small flame would remain come morning. If it died completely, starting anew required flint, steel, and patience or a neighbor's goodwill. Every household had its tricks, which would burn long, which sparked, which smoked less. Ash was prized for its steady burn. Oak was good but slow to start. Pine lit quickly but popped and smoked. Wet wood was accursed hissed, smoked, and gave little heat. Gathering dry, seasoned wood was a daily task in some regions, and a seasonal chore in others. Entire days could be spent walking, chopping, drying, stacking, and still accidents happened. Sparks leaped from logs. A shift in wind might carry flame to a hanging cloth or the hem of a tunic. In crowded homes, where children played near the fire and straw lay scattered on the floor, the danger was ever present. Burns were common. Clothing caught fire. Roofs were lost in a heartbeat. Fires at night were feared most. Sleep dulled awareness. A gust of wind, a falling log, a curtain drawn too near these could all turn warmth into disaster. Entire villages, built of timber and thatch, could vanish overnight in flame. Towns often passed laws forbidding certain fires after dark, or requiring clay chimneys, though enforcement was patchy. Despite the risks, fire remained sacred. It was where bread rose, where stews thickened, where metal was softened and tools repaired. Women spent long hours at the hearth stoking, stirring, sweeping, their faces ruddy from heat, their eyes watering, their hands cracked from constant exposure. Children learned early to fear the red glow of coals, to mind their feet near the edge, to keep a safe distance from boiling pots. In larger homes, manor houses, castles' fireplaces were grander but no less risky. Stone hearths lined the walls, often wide enough to step into. Chimneys drew smoke upward more efficiently, but not perfectly. Soot still stained tapestries. Ash still choked the air. Servants tended fires throughout the day, carrying wood from stores and clearing out cold ash in the early morning hours. Fires burned in kitchens, great halls, and bedrooms, wherever people lived. Fire followed, but even stone could not contain it. Chimneys clogged, sparks leaped from grates, dry rushes on the floor ignited. In wealthier towns, fire watchers patrolled at night, ringing bells at the first sign of trouble. Yet often it was too late. Cities like London, Paris, and Bruges burned. More than once in the Middle Ages, after each great fire, laws were written. Materials changed, but the risk never fully vanished. And yet, fire was still a comfort. People gathered around it. Meals were shared in its glow. Wounds were cauterized by it. Iron was shaped and healed by its heat. In monasteries, candles were lit as symbols of divine presence. In churches, eternal flames flickered near altars. Fire was life, faith, warmth and fear at night. When the wind howled outside and frost crept along the windows, the hearth was the heart of the home. Even if the room filled with smoke, even if sparks flew, even if the warmth didn't reach the far corners, that central flicker meant safety. But always, one eye stayed open, a log to dry, a wind too strong, a moment too long away. Because in the medieval world, fire was never just a flame. It was a companion, a danger, a promise, and every day it had to be respected anew. In the medieval home, discomfort wasn't confined to the cold. Beyond the biting wind and smoke-thick air was another world, one of subtle intrusions and unseen dangers. It came not from storms or swords, but from what crept beneath floorboards, bred in straw and lingered in still air. It was the world of vermin, stench, and sickness, a daily, inescapable part of medieval life. The battle began with the floor itself. Most peasants lived above bare earth, dusty in summer, muddy in spring, and freezing in winter. Straw or rushes were laid down as simple flooring, perhaps mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary in hopes of masking unpleasant smells. These coverings soaked up spills, animal waste, and food scraps. They were changed infrequently. Beneath them, a hidden world thrived. Lice, fleas, mites, and beetles, along with the occasional writhing maggot or worm. Rats and mice were constant companions. They lived in the thatch above, the straw below, and the walls between. At night, they skittered and chewed, their sharp teeth finding sacks of grain, stored meat, and sometimes even sleeping fingers. Cats were both pets and pest control for their hunting skills, but even they couldn't stop the tide. Rats were clever, quick, and numerous. Their presence was expected, tolerated, and cursed in equal measure. Bugs plagued every class. Fleas bit both noble and peasant. Bedbugs infested straw mattresses and coarse woolen blankets. Lice crawled through hair and clothes. People scratched constantly. Children cried from the itch, and scratching sores sometimes festered. Hygiene, such as it was, couldn't keep up. Baths were rare. Washing clothes was a chore done in streams or with boiled water, and drying was slow in the damp. Most simply endured. The smells inside a medieval home were layered and ever-present. Smoke from the hearth clung to everything: clothes, skin, food, even dreams. But beneath that was something older and heavier. The scent of unwashed bodies, of animals sleeping indoors, of chamber pots emptied only when full, of damp walls and spoiled food. Many homes had no separate space for animals. Pigs, chickens, and goats often lived under the same roof, separated by a half wall if lucky. Their odors mingled with the rest, creating a stew of scent that clung to the nostrils. Human waste was dealt with in varied ways. Chamber pots were common, but emptied into the street, the garden, or a pit out back. In towns, waste flowed down open gutters between houses. In the countryside, it was buried or left in middens heaps of refuse that bred flies and worse. Public latrines existed in larger cities, often near rivers, but were rarely cleaned well. The air near these areas was foul, and many held their breath as they passed. Inside the home, illness found fertile ground. Cold air and damp walls weakened the body. Poor ventilation made respiratory infections common. Coughs lingered, fevers flared, and simple colds became deadly. Germs were unknown, disease was often blamed on bad air, sign, or imbalance of the bodily humors. But people noticed patterns. When the rats came, sickness followed. When the well turned murky, bellies ached. When a neighbor coughed blood, others followed soon after. The most vulnerable infants, the elderly, and the sick suffered the most. Children often died before their 5th year, taken by fevers, diarrhea, or unseen infections. Midwives did their best. Folk remedies were whispered from mother to daughter, and herbal teas steeped in smoky kitchens, but medicine was rudimentary. A poultice, a prayer, or a leech, sometimes all three. And yet, amid these conditions, people lived. They laughed, worked, bore children, and sang songs. They endured what they could not change. They learned which herbs calmed fever, which leaves soothed itching, and how to keep a fire burning low through the night to discourage pests. They spoke of cures passed down through generations, and some truly helped. Others didn't, but hope, too, had its uses. In the homes of the wealthy, things were marginally better. Stone walls reduced drafts. There were wooden floors, sometimes raised beds. Latrines were more common chutes that led outside or down into cesspits. But these, too, bred disease, if not cleaned. Wealth could buy furs, glass windows, and privacy, but it could not banish lice or keep out rats. Servants brought them in. Guests carried them unknowingly. Filth respected no rank. In monasteries, where cleanliness was encouraged, order reigned for a time. Monks washed regularly, wore clean robes, and followed strict routines. Yet even there, outbreaks occurred. Cleanliness helped, but isolation helped more. Disease always found a way through a crack. In this world, the senses were sharpened, not by beauty, but by survival. A mother could tell sickness by the flush on a child's cheek. A farmer knew rot by smell alone. A servant girl knew the sound of mice beneath the floorboards. Life taught them to listen, to notice, to endure, and somehow, in the midst of these quiet daily battles, there was still space for joy. A loaf of bread that didn't mold. A day without scratching. A baby that grew strong. A rat caught in a trap. A night without coughing. Small victories. Private reliefs in the medieval home. People didn't live in the absence of discomfort. They lived through it. They breathed through stench. They laughed despite pests. They made homes in spaces where others today might flinch. And when the night came, as it always did, they banked the fire, pulled the blanket close, scratched one last time, and let sleep carry them gently past the scratching in the walls and the groan of the cold beams overhead. In the still light of morning, before the church bell tolled and before the first cock crowed, a figure would rise from a bed of straw, stretch aching limbs, and pull on a coarse wool tunic stiff from yesterday's labor. The figure was not free, not in body nor in future. He or she was a serf, and their life was not theirs to own. To be a serf in the medieval world was to be born to the soil, not just upon it, but into it. The land one tilled, the cottage one inhabited, even the tools one used were not truly one's own. The lord of the manor held dominion. The serf held duty. And though serfdom was not slavery in the strictest sense it could feel, too many, just as binding, the life of a serf was shaped entirely by obligation. There was land to work small plots, handed down from father to son, rented in labor rather than coin. In return for this patch of earth, the serf owed his lord labor services, known as corvée. 3 days a week, sometimes more, he would leave his own field fallow to work the lord's land. He plowed it, sowed it, harvested it, gathered firewood, repaired fences, dug ditches, mended roads. In planting season and at harvest, those days stretched longer. Work began before sunrise and often ended in darkness, lit only by the flicker of an oil lamp or moonlight catching on dewy leaves. The labor was heavy. Tools were primitive wooden plows pulled by oxen, hoes made of iron and bone. The ground was unforgiving, the weather a constant gamble. Women worked too, and not only in the home. They weeded fields, tended animals, spun wool, baked bread, fetched water, cared for children, and still found time to fulfill their share of dues. Children helped as soon as they could walk, their games interwoven with chores, scaring off birds from seed, gathering kindling, hauling water in pails nearly as large as they were. The calendar was not marked by holidays, but by feast days and field days. The church imposed spiritual rhythms, and the manor imposed agricultural ones. Between Lent and Easter, haying and harvest, planting and ploughing, there was little time to rest. Every season demanded something. Every change in weather meant new tasks, and each task had consequences if not done well or fast enough. But labor alone was not the end of a serf's burden. There were rents and taxes to be paid, not in coins, which many never saw, but in kind, a portion of grain, eggs, cheese, or a chicken for the lord. At certain times of the year, they might owe extra dues known as boon work, or a small payment to marry, to inherit a field, or to pass it on to a child. Even the mill, where grain was ground into flour, belonged to the lord. Serfs had too. Pay to use a tand could be punished for grinding grain at home. The word villain, often used interchangeably with serf, came from the same root as village. It was a reminder these people belonged to the manor, to the village, to the system. They were unfree, legally tied to the land and its lord. They could not leave without permission. If the manor was sold or passed to another noble, they were sold with it. Still, not all was uniform. Some serfs were better off than others, those with larger plots or special skills, such as blacksmithing or carpentry. Some owned a cow, a few pigs, perhaps even a cart. Others had barely a patch of earth and survived on scraps and charity. Some manors were cruel and exacting. Others allowed a measure of dignity, even affection between lord and laborer. But always, the imbalance of power remained. And yet, even in such circumstances, hope persisted. Festivals, though often followed by days of labor, offered music, dancing, and shared food. Love found its way between furrows and firelight. Songs were sung, stories told, hands held. Children laughed even when their bellies were empty. A good harvest brought joy. A newborn wondered. Religion, too, offered meaning. The church taught that suffering on earth earned reward in heaven. And while the priest might live more comfortably than his flock, he walked among them, performed there. Weddings, buried their dead, baptized their young. He was the voice of the eternal in a world of toil. In some rare cases, a serf might buy his freedom-saving coins from small sales or outside labor, or he might escape to a town and live there for a year and a day, earning legal independence. These were exceptions, whispered about but rarely achieved. For most, life began and ended within a few miles of where they were born, and even then, death did not end all dues. The death of a serf could incur Harriata fee to the lord, often paid with the best animal or possession left behind. The land would pass to a son or daughter, but never without the lord's knowledge and consent. Still, despite the burdens, the medieval serf endured. His world was small, yes, but it was his. The field he tilled, the tree under which he rested, the path his feet knew better than his mind, all of it became familiar, even dear. In hardship, he found rhythm. In repetition, he found place, and in the quiet hours, after the work was done, when the stars blinked through the smoky air and the world was still perhaps, he dreamed of a different life. Not out of anger or rebellion, just curiosity. What lay beyond the woods, beyond the manor walls? But the dawn would come, and the plough awaited. And so, once more, he would bend to the soil, bound not just by custom, but by centuries of repetition, duty, and quiet resolve. The medieval world was not an even field. It was a steep and stony mountain, with most souls struggling near the bottom, while a privileged few stood watch from the heights. The feudal system was less a society than a hierarchy made tangible. And within this pyramid of power, every person had a place assigned not by merit, but by birth. At the very top sat the king, chosen by lineage and often crowned with divine approval. His was the throne, the crown, the sword of state. But, in truth, the king's grip on power varied. Some ruled as giants, their word law across land and sea. Others were figureheads, constantly negotiating, often betrayed. Still, all power in the kingdom, whether in the courtroom or on the battlefield, flowed from him, at least in theory. Below the king stood his nobles, the great lords and barons who held vast territories in his name. These men, and occasionally women, were granted land in exchange for loyalty, taxes, and military service. Their wealth came not just from gold or inheritance, but from the labor of the thousands who toiled on their estates. The noble class lived in stone keeps, dined on fine bread and roast meat, and wore rich fabrics, said they were also political creatures, always watching, always wary. Alliances could shift like sand. These great lords then divided their land among vassals, lesser nobles and knights, who in turn swore fealty, offered soldiers when called, and collected dues from the peasants under them. This network of oaths, favors, and inheritances created a tangled web of power that could support a strangled kingdoms. The knight held a unique place in this pyramid. He was both noble and warrior, bound by chivalry, a code, more romantic in poetry than practice. Knights trained from youth, beginning as pages, then squires, before finally being dubbed in a solemn ceremony. Their armor was heavy, their swords costly, their horses prized. Yet many knights were land poor, granted honor but little wealth. To maintain armor, arms, and a warhorse required significant income. Often, the knight relied on peasants to farm his estate while he served in battle or at court. Knighthood was, in part, a performance. Tournaments showcased strength and valor, but they were also social ladders and political stages. A well-fought joust could attract the favor of a ladior, a powerful lord. Behind the lances and banners, knights were enforcers of their lord's will. In times of war, they led men into battle. In peace, they collected taxes, dispensed rough justice, and ensured the order remained intact. And beneath them, all stretching wide across the base of the pyramid, were the peasants. Most of them were serfs, as we've seen, though some were freemen, not tied to the land, but still bearing the weight of taxation and survival. They outnumbered the nobles 100-fold, yet their power was nearly non-existent. In theory, They were protected by the knights and lords. In practice, they bore the burdens that fed them. Feudalism was not merely about land, it was about control. A lord did not simply own a manor. He controlled its justice, its trade, its militia. He could levy tolls, demand fines, impose rules. His word was often law, especially in remote regions where royal authority was distant. This decentralization gave local lords immense power, but also bred conflict. One noble's ambition was another's enemy. In towns and cities, a different order began to stir. Guilds of craftsmen and merchants formed tight communities, operating under charters and codes. These were not quite feudal, not quite freer, sign of the world shifting slowly under the old system's weight. A wealthy merchant could rival a poor knight in comfort. A skilled blacksmith might earn more than a petty noble. But social climbing was slow, difficult, and dangerous. Religion, too, wove itself into the pyramid. The church was not separate from power, it was part of it. Bishops and abbots often held lands like nobles, ruled over peasants, and enforced both spiritual and civil law. The Pope, from distant Rome, could rival kings, and local priests answered more to bishops than to barons. In many ways, the church was a parallel feudal system, with its own hierarchy, rituals, and loyalties. This entire structure was held together by fear, faith, and familiarity. People accepted their place, not always because they believed it was fair, but because it was all they knew. To question it was dangerous. To challenge it, fatal. Rebellions occurred moments when the base of the pyramid shook, but they were rare, and rarely successful. The system did offer order. In a world of invasions, plagues, and uncertainty, feudalism brought structure. People knew who they served, what they owed, and what was expected. Oaths were taken seriously. To break fealty was to risk excommunication, dishonor, or death. Yet, this order came at a cost. It smothered ambition for most. It crushed dissent. It enshrined inequality. The pyramid's shape left many at the bottom, pressed by the weight of those above. Still, the system persisted generation after generation, because it worked well enough to keep itself alive. Because those at the top defended it fiercely, and because those below, tired and weary, had little power to change it. It is tempting to view feudalism as cold and mechanical, but within its strict lines lived real people. A knight who wept after war, a lord who showed mercy, a peasant who prayed for a better life. Not all were cruel, not all were content, but all were bound by duty, by fear, by tradition, and thus the pyramid stood, silent, unmoving, towering over the daily lives of millions. In the soft morning stillness of a medieval village, you might hear the clink of coins or more often, the shuffle of chickens, the rustle of sacks, the creak of carts. These were the payments of the common people. Not voluntary offerings, not generous gifts, but obligations, many varied, and always do. To live in the medieval world meant paying tithes to the church, rents to one's lord, fines to the manor court, tolls to the town gate, and taxes to the crown. These weren't rare occurrences, they were woven into the rhythm of life, like seasons or harvests. You paid when you were born, you paid when you died, and in between, you paid some more. Let us begin with the tithe, the most familiar, and perhaps the most quietly resented. The tithe was owed to the church, usually a tenth of one's produce, livestock, or earnings. 10 eggs from the hen. 1. For the priest, 10 sheaves of wheat. one for the church barn. It was not optional, and it was not symbolic. Church officials kept careful records. The tithe might fund the upkeep of the parish church, the priest's livelihood, and alms for the poor, but not always. In some cases, it went straight to a bishop or monastery far away. Refusing to pay was seen as both a sin and a crime. One could be excommunicated for non-compliance or fined by the local lord, since religion and governance were rarely far apart. And while the tithe might sting in a year of abundance, in a year of poor harvest or disease, it could feel cruel, even. Ruinous then came the manorial dues. A serf might owe his lord a variety of payments. A heriot when a family member died, usually the best ox or tool. A merchant when a daughter married a fee for her release from the manor, or a chievage if he tried to work elsewhere. Even something as small as baking bread in a private oven could draw a fine if the lord owned the communal bakehouse. Most peasants also had to use the lord's mill to grind grain and pay for the privilege, often with a portion of the flour. Using hand mills or grinding stones at home, known as quernstones, could be illegal. There were also payments for using the wine press, the dovecote, or the fish pond. Every tool and service was monetized, not in coin, then in kind: eggs, wool, butter, geese. If the manor court summoned you for a fence fallen, a pig loose, a quarrel with your neighbor, you'd pay a fine, even if innocent. These courts served justice, yes, but they were also revenue machines. A portion of the fines lined the lord's purse, and so the list of offenses was long, often petty. It kept people in line and kept the manor solvent. Over all this loomed the royal tax collector. Kings were forever in need: wars to fight, debts to pay, castles to maintain. And so, royal taxes came in waves. Some were familiar: the geld, the carukage, the poll tax. Others were one-time emergency levies that returned again and again. These were often collected by sheriffs or appointed collectors, who might take liberties in their method or their math. For many villagers, taxes meant parting with what little they had: a clutch of coins saved over years, or the last sack of grain, or a treasured away. Protests were rare and dangerous. If a community refused to pay, they could be fined further, imprisoned, or worse. In towns and cities, the weight was different but no less heavy. Merchants paid stall rents, guild fees, and trade tolls. Travelers passing through might pay to cross a bridge, enter a gate, or use a market square. Even widows, once exempt in many places, were increasingly taxed in the later Middle Ages as the crown sought new sources of income. The pressure was constant. But what made it worse was that relief never truly came. A good year might ease the burden, but most years brought hardship. A late frost, a wet summer, a failed crop, and suddenly the dues became impossible. Families sold possessions, children were sent to work. People borrowed from neighbors, who themselves owed more than they could spare. If the weather or war brought true disaster, many fell into arrears. Debts grew, lands were seized. Some fled to towns, hoping for anonymity and opportunity. Others turned to outlawry. Desperation bred risk. It is easy to think of these burdens as numbers, as percentages. But for the people living under them, they were deeply personal. They measured out lives in spoons of flour, in a lamb not eaten but handed over, in coins buried in secret and dug up with shaking hands. And yet, in this grinding system, resilience persisted. Some years were better. Lords, at times, showed mercy. Priests forgave tithes for the ill. Neighbors helped each other pay. There were moments rare, but real, when generosity overcame duty, and always people adapted. They found hidden paths, shared secrets, whispered warnings. They planted quiet gardens out of sight. They learned which collectors might be bargained with, and which should be feared. And they remembered past from father to son, mother to daughter, how to survive under weight. Because in the medieval world, the question was never whether you owed something. It was only whether you had enough left after giving it. In the soft gloom of a medieval hall, beneath beams blackened by fire smoke, the villagers would gather, men with hats in hand, women silent, children peering through doorways. This was manor court day, when disputes were settled and penalties passed. There was no jury in the modern sense, no trained lawyers, just the steward, the Lord's scribe, perhaps the Lord himself. And for those summoned, the stakes were often higher than they dared show. In the feudal world, justice was decentralized. While kings issued laws, it was the local lord who often enforced them. His manor court held authority over the peasants who lived on his land. It handled matters great and small: a missing pig, a broken fence, unpaid dues, a violent quarrel. The court's tone could be calm and orderly, or cold and merciless, depending on the lord and his mood. The most common cases were about land and labor. Who owed what? Who failed to report for harvest work? Whose field encroached by a handspan onto another's? But punishment was not always about crime. It was about control. Fines reminded people who held power. Repeated offenses might result in more than coin: seizure of property, public shaming, even forced labor. When matters were more serious, theft, violence, or accusations of immorality, the process grew darker. In some places, trial by ordeal was still used. A person might be made to plunge their hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. If the wound healed cleanly after 3 days, they were declared innocent. In other cases, they were bound and tossed into water. Floating meant guilt, sinking, innocence. It was a brutal logic, rooted in superstition and divine judgment. The belief was not that these ordeals were fair, but that God would reveal the truth through them. But as time passed, these practices faded, replaced by sworn oaths, witnesses, and community assessments. Still, fairness was far from guaranteed. Nobles had their own courts, far above those of peasants. They were tried among their peers, or not tried at all. A knight might commit the same crime as a farmer and face far lesser consequences. A baron's dispute with another lord might be settled by duel, or with bribes, or through royal favor. Power insulated those who held it, and when a peasant dared challenge that power, even through truth, the results were rarely kind. For serious offenses, capital punishment was common. Hanging was the fate of thieves, murderers, and outlaws. The gallows stood on hills outside the village, a visible warning. In towns, executions drew crowds. They were part justice, part theater. Heads might be mounted on spikes, bodies displayed at crossroads. Shame was a tool as much as death. Other punishments aimed to humiliate. The pillory and stocks held offenders for hours or days, exposed to gears, rotten food, and sometimes stones. The scold's bridler cruel iron mask was placed on the heads of women accused of gossip or disrespect. Branding, whipping, nose slitting all were used, especially in regions where harshness was considered a sign of strong rule. But justice was not always cruel. In some cases, especially in close-knit villages, mediation took place. Neighbors worked out disputes. Compensation was paid, apologies made, and matters settled quietly. A lost cow might be returned with no penalty. A minor theft repaid with extra labor. People knew one another. Harshness was saved for strangers, or repeated offenders, or those who tested the boundaries of their place. And then there were the church courts. Separate from secular justice, these dealt with moral and spiritual matters: adultery, heresy, blasphemy, failure to attend Mass. Clergy accused of crimes were often tried here, and they were treated more leniently. The phrase "benefit of clergy" became notorious, allowing educated men to escape harsh sentences by reciting a verse of Latin. These courts were less bloody, but still powerful. Excommunication could ruin a man. A penance of public whipping outside the church doors could haunt a family for generations. Confessions were expected. Contrition, displayed at the top of the judicial system, was the king's court, a realm of parchment. Latin records, robed justices, and royal seals. But few villagers ever saw it. The journey was long, the costs high, and justice slow. Even if they reached it, success was uncertain. The system favored the literate, the wealthy, the well-connected. Most peasants stayed far away. So justice, in the medieval world, was a tapestry: local, personal, inconsistent. It could be as swift as a fine, or as final as a rope. It could favor the poor in one village and punish them harshly in another. It reflected the personalities of those who ruled, the customs of the place, and the tides of power. What united it all was this: law was not a shield, not for the weak. It was a tool, wielded most effectively by those already strong. And yet, like everything else in the medieval world, people endured. They learned when to speak, when to kneel, when to remain silent. They whispered advice to their children, bartered favors with neighbors, prayed before the court bell rang. They carved justice from injustice with cleverness and luck, because, even in a world where the sword judged more often than the scroll, people still hoped for fairness, and sometimes, quietly, they found it. It began, as many things did in the medieval world, with a whisper: quiet rumors drifting in from distant ports, from merchant caravans, from the mouths of monks who had seen too much. Ships had docked with sails furled but no crew alive. Villages had emptied overnight. Entire households, they said, lay still with candles still burning. And then it came closer. The plague arrived, not with a roar, but with a hush that fell across town squares, along market stalls, through the narrow alleys of cities, and into the thatched cottages of the countryside. Doors were shut and never opened again. Bells tolled more often. The air grew thick with dread. We know it now as the Black Death, a name it earned in memory, not in the moment. In the mid-14th century, it swept through Europe like a cold wind through an open field. It came from the east, carried by fleas and rats aboard merchant ships, though no one knew it then. The people of the time could not see the Yersinia pestis. Bacterium, what they saw, what they feared, was the fever, the swellings, the blackened limbs, the sudden silence, to wake one morning with a headache, a stiffness in the neck, or a swollen lump under the arm was to count the hours. Death came quickly, often within days, and it did not choose. The young and the old, the pious and the wicked, the rich and the ragged, it took them all. In cities, corpses outnumbered coffins. In villages, whole families vanished. Panic gave way to paralysis. Priests refused last rites. Physicians fled. The courts stopped. Even the lords shut their gates. Streets were empty. Churches echoed with the lonely voices of those who dared remain. And through it all, the plague moved steadily, quietly, across hills and rivers, fields and forests. The medieval mind struggled to explain. Was it a punishment from God? A curse brought by strangers? A corruption in the stars? Theories abounded. Some believed it was caused by bad air miasma, so they lit fires and carried posies to their faces. Others blamed Jews, foreign travelers, or heretics, leading to violent persecution. Fear turned to rage, and rage to horror. But in truth, there was no understanding-only response. Some flagellants roamed the land, whipping themselves in public processions, begging for divine mercy. Others turned to sin, believing the world was ending and there was no reason left for virtue. Most simply stayed quiet, stayed inside, and waited. Burial became impossible. The graveyards filled. Bodies were thrown into massed pits, hastily covered with earth. The air soured with rot. Bells tolled not in ritual, but in rhythm, hour by hour, name by name, until there were no more names to toll, and still the plague moved on. The countryside suffered differently, but no less. With fewer people, a single death might unravel an entire village. If the blacksmith fell ill, tools went unsharpened. If the priest died, the sacraments ceased. If the field workers sickened, the harvest failed. Families hid in their homes, alone, listening to the wind in the thatch and the coughing of neighbors. And when it was over, if it ever felt over, the survivors emerged into a changed world. In some villages, no one returned. The land went wild, the homes collapsed, the paths were overgrown. In others, only a handful remained, bewildered, grieving, unsure whether to rebuild or flee. Children grew up without parents. Elders buried their sons. Survivors carried strange guilt, wondering why they were spared. And yet, somehow, life resumed. Fields were ploughed again, though slowly. Towns reawakened. Bells began to ring for weddings, not just funerals. But the memory never left. People whispered of it for generations. It shaped dreams, stories, fears. It changed how people saw the world and each other. Laborers, now scarce, began to ask for more pay, more rights, more freedom. Lords resisted. Revolts flared. The old order, once unshakable, had cracked. Not broken, but changed. The plague had taken bodies, yes, but it also took certainty. In its place, it left silence and questions. What is life if it can vanish so quickly? What is order if it cannot protect? What is faith when prayers go unanswered? In this quiet world turned quiet stiller, people searched for meaning. Some found it in new devotions, some in family, some in a bitter, quiet endurance. But all remembered the hush that had come before the plague, and the deeper silence it left behind. When illness struck in the Middle Ages, it did not merely hurt the body, it settled the mind, stirred the soul, and frightened entire communities. Sickness was not just a matter of biology, but a matter of belief. Tangled in a world where medicine stood half in science and half in superstition, and in this twilight place, every cure was a kind of prayer. To become ill was to enter a kind of shadow. A fever might be sent by God, a rash, perhaps, by a witch. A cough that lingered too long was its punishment for sin, or something foul. In the air, no one truly knew. And so, healing began, not always with herbs or hot compresses, but with confession. At the heart of medieval medicine was the theory of humors, inherited from ancient Greek thought and passed down through the writings of Hippocrates and Galen. The body, it was believed, held for humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health came when these were in balance. Illness was an imbalance. The goal was to restore harmony. A cheerful man, perhaps, had too much blood. A melancholic one, too much black bile. A weeping woman might be told her womb had wandered. And a man with burning eyes and a dry coffee must have an excess of yellow bile. Treatments were built around these ideas, strange to us now, but to the people of the time they offered structure, a way to make sense of the inexplicable. Barber surgeons were the closest thing to doctors in many towns. They shaved beards, pulled teeth, and performed basic surgery. Their shops smelled of iron and blood. They carried knives, saws, and bandages, often a steady hand. For deeper ailments, one might turn to a physician learned, robed in dark fabric, often Latin-speaking. They carried urine flasks for diagnosis, consulted astrological charts, and wrote prescriptions in elegant script. But for most peasants and common folk, healing came not from scholars or surgeons, but from the wise woman at the edge of the village. The herbalist, the midwife, the healer with her bundle of dried plants and murmured incantations. These were the hands that delivered babies, soothed fevers, wrapped wounds in poultices of crushed comfrey and honey. The remedies varied wildly. A sore throat might be treated with a gargle of vinegar and herbs. Boils were lanced and packed with garlic paste. Wounds were sealed with cobwebs, believed to have antiseptic properties. For toothaches, there was clove and wine and prayers to Saint Apollonia. For madness, cold baths and shaved heads. For nightmares, blessed amulets under the pillow. More serious ailments, plague, epilepsy, leprosy drew more desperate responses. Leeches were used to draw off excess blood, cupping with hot glass or horn to restore balance, blistering agents to release poison through the skin. And always, prayer for divine healing was the most trusted cure of all. Hospitals, such as they were usually run by the church. These were not places of high medicine, but of charity and rest. The poor, the sick, and the dying were tended to by monks and nuns who offered food, warmth, and scripture. Infirmaries were quiet. Solemn places rose of beds, low-voiced hymns, and the scent of lavender and holy oil. But not all healers were welcomed. Those who practiced outside the church's blessing were often feared. Witchcraft was a constant whisper. A healer with too many cures, too much knowledge, too strange. A gaze she could be accused, especially in times of panic. And so, many worked in silence, passing their knowledge from mother to daughter, careful never to seem too wise. Even in the courts of kings, medicine was uncertain. Royal physicians might prescribe crushed pearls, powdered unicorn horn, or gold leaf to cure the ailments of nobility. The results were rarely better than those in a village hut. Still, faith in the practice persisted. It had to. For in the face of suffering, belief was as important as bomb, and yet, despite the misunderstandings, there was wisdom woven into the law. Herbs like willow bark for pain, pennyroyal for digestion, and yarrow for wounds were genuinely effective. Honey acted as an antiseptic. Onion poultices reduced swelling. People observed, they learned, they recorded what worked. Not always perfectly, not always safely, but with care, and with the best intentions they could offer. In many cases, the cure was not in the remedy, but in the presence, the touch of a hand the cool cloth on a forehead, the bowl of soup brought quietly to a bedside. In a world with no anesthesia, no antibiotics, no clear answers, comfort itself was a kind of medicine. And when healing failed, as it often did, the final rites were given, the soul prepared, family gathered, and another candle was lit against the dark. In the time of pestilence, the world shrank. When word of sickness spread, be it the plague, smallpox, or the dreaded sweating sickness, stores closed before greetings were exchanged, and windows became watchful eyes instead of open invitations. Communities that once gathered in fields, churches, or taverns began to pull apart, one household at a time. The village square grew quiet. The laughter of children vanished from the lanes. Fear became more contagious than the disease itself. Medieval people understood little about how illness spread, but they understood enough to be afraid. They saw that the sick often infected the healthy. They noticed how a home that took in a coughing stranger might soon be quiet forever. And so they began to practice something like what we now call quarantine, not from science, but from survival in cities. Plague houses were marked with painted signs, red crosses, or sometimes simple warnings: "Lord, have mercy." Doors were nailed shut. Bread and water were left outside. Entire families were sealed within, sometimes with care, often with indifference. And there they stayed, watched from a distance, counted down in days. In Venice, port authorities began holding ships offshore for 40 days, 40 giorni, term that would become quarantine. Elsewhere, travelers were turned away at the gates of towns. Roads were blocked. Pilgrimages halted. Even priests grew reluctant to enter homes. Some would stand at the doorway, muttering rites through cloth, tossing holy water rather than anointing directly. The sick were not always abandoned, but they were often segregated, physically and emotionally. Lepers, for example, were forced to live in separate colonies, ring bells to warn of their approach, and wear special clothing to signal their affliction. People crossed the road to avoid them. Children were taught to look away. The disease made them not only ill, but invisible. Those who remained in their homes did so with an ever-present weight. A mother who began to cough might hide it from her children. A father who felt feverish might say nothing, not out of courage, but of fear of being locked away, or worse, of drawing suspicion. People learned to live quietly, to mask their symptoms, to conceal even suffering. Loneliness became a kind of plague itself. For those quarantined or avoided, the silence grew louder than the symptoms. The absence of touch, the lack of laughter, the void where the familiar rhythm of life once beat, even the sound of bells meant to signal hope, prayer, or community came to mark death and isolation. Some who survived their illness emerged into a world no longer familiar, their friends gone, their neighbors moved, their homes ransacked or abandoned, and in their return, they were often met not with celebration, but suspicion. Survivors were sometimes treated as cursed or contagious, whispered about, avoided in markets and gatherings. The pain of solitude was perhaps most deeply felt by the elderly and the young. The old, once held close by family, were sometimes pushed away out of fear they might catch or carry disease. The young, orphaned or left alone, wandered fields and streets without knowing what had happened. Only that the world had grown quieter and colder. Churches, once the heart of community, began to reflect this isolation. Masses were sparsely attended. Communion rituals were altered or halted. Monasteries closed their gates. The sound of choir song faded, replaced by the occasional lonely chant for the dead. For some, faith deepened in solitude, a closeness to God found in silence. For others, faith dimmed, as prayers went unanswered and grief mounted with no one to share it. The psychological toll of all this, what we now might call trauma, was seldom named, but deeply felt. People became cautious, suspicious, emotionally withdrawn. Hospitality withered. Weddings were postponed. Feasts were avoided. Hugs and handshakes became dangerous. To survive sometimes meant to refuse connection, to avoid love, lest it be followed by loss. And yet, even in these long stretches of isolation, small acts of connection survived. A neighbor might still leave a warm loaf on a doorstep. A priest might sing outside a dying woman's home. Children might play from opposite sides of a field, never crossing paths, but laughing just the same. Letters to rare as they were became lifelines. A note carried by a traveler, a message sent by monk or merchant. Not all communication stopped. It just moved more slowly, more carefully, and always wrapped in caution. Those who emerged from the long dark of quarantine carried with them a new kind of silence. Not the silence of solitude alone, but of changed hearts, hearts more wary, more observant, more attuned to loss. They knew the fragility of community, the delicacy of touch, the quiet cost of safety, and they rebuilt not always with joy, but with patience. They reopened doors slowly. They walked softly into the homes of others. They sang again, though not quite as loudly. They held hands, though perhaps a bit more tightly, because after so much distance, even the smallest reunion could feel like a miracle. When the world was full of pain, when death arrived uninvited and unexplainable, when isolation pressed against the walls of the home and silence fell over entire towns, people turned inward toward faith, toward superstition, toward anything that might make sense of what could not be seen. In the Middle Ages, God was everywhere. He was in the rain, in the harvest, in the cry of a newborn, and in the thunder that rolled over distant hills. People lived in a world alive with divine presence, a world shaped by angels, saints, devils, and omens. Every event, no matter how mundane or catastrophic, was understood as part of a cosmic pattern, and so, when suffering came, as it so often did, it was rarely viewed as random. Illness might be punishment for sin, either personal or communal. A poor harvest might be a trial sent by God. A fevered child might be under the eye of a jealous spirit, and a healthy man struck down overnight. Surely he had offended the saints or broken a vow. The church offered structure. Its bells marked the hours. Its services brought rhythm to the weak. Its teachings gave names to fear, pride, lust, gluttony, wrath. And it offered paths to redemption through confession, fasting, pilgrimage, and penance. In a time of constant uncertainty, the church gave certainty, but not always comfort. During plagues or famines, many wondered if the church had failed them, if their prayers were unanswered, if their priests fled or fell ill themselves. Where was the protection they had been promised? Some responded with deeper devotion. Others turned to alternative explanations, old traditions, and whispered rituals passed from elder to child. And thus, alongside official faith, superstition bloomed. People hung charms by their doorposts, nails, herbs, carvings of protective saints. They carried amulets of bone or stone to ward off illness. They avoided crossroads at twilight, feared black cats, watched the skies for falling stars or blood-colored moons. The world was full of signs, if only one knew how to read them. There were folk healers who whispered over wounds, cunning women who mixed poultices with prayers. There were blessings spoken over bread, and curses feared in mirrors, in places far from the bishop's reach. The line between faith and folklore blurred into something deeply personal, deeply human. Dreams, too, carried weight. A vision of a lost loved one, a dream of fire or floods. People recorded them, feared them, sought meaning in their symbols. Books of dream interpretation, written by monks, were passed hand to hand, because in the quiet of a long night, a dream might feel like a message perhaps from heaven, or perhaps from somewhere more ancient. Pilgrimage became not just a journey, but a search for understanding. People walked hundreds of miles to visit the shrine of a saint. They knelt before relics, bones of martyrs, drops of blood, fragments of the true cross, not merely out of ritual, but out of desperate hope that they might be healed, that they might be forgiven, that they might matter. And in all of this faith and fear, ritual and rumor, people were trying to make meaning in a world that so often felt cruel. They were not foolish, they were not simple, they were fragile, as all people are when they suffer. And they reached for what they could. The rosary, the recipe, the whispered charm, the soft chant in the dark. There were moments, too, of transcendence. A choir singing in the high vaults of a cathedral, a procession of candlelight in the dead of winter, a mother praying over her child's brow. These were moments when people felt connected to each other, to the divine, to something larger than fear. But even faith was not always enough. Some lost belief entirely. They turned bitter. They mocked priests, avoided churches, refused to kneel. Others slipped quietly into heretical movements, groups that offered different visions of God, of salvation, of justice. The Cathars, the Waldensians, the Lollards. Their voices were often silenced, but their questions remained. Why do the good suffer? Why do the wicked flourish? Why, when we pray, is the world still so hard? These questions echoed in stone halls, behind monastery walls, in the minds of farmers, and in the hearts of children. There were no easy answers, only more stories, more rituals, more attempts to shape the world into something that could be understood, and perhaps endured. And yet, even in the quiet despair, there was resilience. Not just of body, but of spirit. Not just survival, but searching for meaning, for hope, for light in the long dark. Because to live in the Middle Ages was not just to suffer, it was to seek, even without knowing where the path would lead.